This Karen's audacity went beyond everything. I live in this half-fancy, half-bankrupt neighborhood governed by one of those infamous HOAs. If you've ever heard of an HOA, you know. It's like a cult, except instead of worship, they worship useless regulations about the color of your mailbox and the angle of your fence. And in charge, of course, was her, the insufferable president of the association. Let's call her the woman, because frankly, calling her Karen is still a bit much. My house was always different. It had a charm that no one else there could copy. It was surrounded by old trees, which not only made it look beautiful, but also provided delicious shade. While everyone else was melting in the summer, I was drinking coffee on the balcony, as if I were on another planet. My neighbors, all envious, especially her. From day one, the woman picked on me. First with the leaves falling on the ground, they'll clog up the street with garbage. Then with the birds. They bring disease. Every week there was a new letter from the association in my mailbox, always written in that tone that made me want to light a barbecue just to annoy them. But the climax came on a hellish Tuesday, with a brain-frying sun, when I arrived home to find my yard devastated. The trees, all of them, cut down, sawed off at the trunk, as if they were criminals. And what's worse, without any warning. No hello, no sorry, no living soul to explain. I stood on the sidewalk looking at the scene, feeling the heat rise in my body and head. It felt like someone had ripped out part of my house. The ground was covered in branches, leaves, sawdust, a mess that made me want to cry. Soon a curious neighbor arrived, looking like he was watching someone else's misfortune, as if it were a stand-up show. Boy, did you see? It was the president. She cut everything off. She said it was outside the community standard. Community standards. People. Standard. Since when did a tree become a crime against aesthetics? I went to her house, but I didn't even have to knock. She was already outside, all smiles, waving her face with a fan as if she'd just saved the planet from a biological threat. That look of superiority on her face deserved a solid gold trophy inscribed, "Most Clueless 2025. Yes, I did, she said, shaking her shoulders like someone pruning a dead bush. They were ruining the visual harmony of the street. The visual harmony of the street. I swear, not even the craziest comedy writer could have written such an absurd line. And do you know what she said afterwards? That I should thank her. Yes, thank you. Because now, my house would appreciate more. As if everyone was desperate to buy a property that looked like a pizza oven in the middle of the desert. I took a deep breath. I breathed again, because I wanted to hose it down right there, with maximum pressure. But the best was yet to come. Because, my friends, if stupidity has a price, this woman was going to start paying it in installments with very high interest rates. And guess what? It was her house that first began to melt under the 50-degree heat that came after the trees disappeared. A human oven. A residential hellhole with 2 suites. In the days following the murder of my trees, the neighborhood became a kind of bizarre spectacle. There were people driving slowly past, looking out of the corner of their eyes, whispering at the gate as if they were watching a live series of other people's misfortunes. I was in the middle of the stage, sweating like a convict. The heat that had previously been blocked by the generous shade was now coming in full force, hitting the walls of my house like a sledgehammer of fire. And it wasn't just a sensation. Inside my living room, the thermometer read 39 degrees in the middle of the afternoon, even with the ceiling fan running at maximum, looking like it was about to take off. Meanwhile, the woman, that creature, acted as if she had done community service. She smiled at people on the street, made a point of commenting loudly on how the street looked more open and cleaner, without my trees messing up the aesthetics of the neighborhood, as if the whole neighborhood had asked for it, as if she had done them a favor. Her prickliness was the size of Texas, and every time I saw her parading down the sidewalk, I felt like watering the lawn as she passed by, if you know what I mean. But divine justice, my friends, is more efficient than any legal process. Because with the trees gone, her house began to smell like hell like never before. It was even funny to watch. At first, she tried to pretend that everything was under control. She bought some ridiculous birthday party tents to shade the yard. She installed colorful umbrellas in the windows, as if she were preparing the house for a permanent luau. He had industrial fans installed in the yard, a real canvas circus in the middle of a residential area. I watched from my balcony, sipping iced tea, with a discreet smile that only those with a clear conscience can manage. But it was no use. The heat entered her house like a furnace thief, invading every room without ceremony. I heard that her central air conditioning unit broke down in the first week of the heat wave, unable to cope with the absurd temperature that hit the walls and roof. Some nearby residents began to comment that she had started sleeping in the living room, surrounded by fans, lying on the tiled floor to try to cool down. Some even swore they had seen her sitting on the sidewalk at 2 in the morning, shaking her face with a cardboard box lid. I almost asked the staff to install a camera just to record this historical wonder. I, on the other hand, was living my life in private hell mode, but it was still bearable, because even without my trees, I had a modicum of common sense and adapted my house to withstand the storm. I bought thermal curtains, installed reflective films on the windows, and did everything in my power to keep it from melting. But her? Oh, she thought her arrogance would stop the sun from frying her house like bacon forgotten in a frying pan. And the most beautiful thing? She couldn't complain to anyone, because after all, it was she who had it cut down without permission. She dug her own grave with the chainsaw. One afternoon, I was sitting on my balcony, trying to decipher whether the sweat I was dripping was from anger or heat, when I saw a rubble truck pull up in front of her house. A team of workers came down from there with sledgehammers, saws, scaffolding. I just watched, curious. The woman appeared at the door with an expression that mixed despair and defeat, explaining like a broken fan. I found out later that she had decided to install new thermal insulation, external cladding, and who knows what else, trying to turn the house into an anti-heat bunker. But in the middle of the construction, the problems began. First, they discovered that the structure of the house was too old to withstand so much adaptation. Then came the surreal budgets, $50,000 to redo the entire facade and install reflective panels. $50,000 that, of course, she didn't have. The woman went into panic mode. She started calling special HOA meetings, trying to push crazy projects on the entire neighborhood, like planting shade bushes in common areas or changing regulations to allow giant awnings on facades, all to try to solve the heat without admitting that she was to blame for everything. With each meeting, the situation became more ridiculous. Each proposal seemed to have come out of a bad comedy script. One day, she suggested that the association install a sort of climate dome over the main street. I almost fell off my chair laughing, but not everyone found it funny. Other neighbors began to realize that the situation at my house was, in reality, a foretaste of what could happen to them too, if the trend took off and they started chopping down trees left and right. People who never even spoke to me started knocking on my door, asking if I was going to sue them, if I had any photos, if I wanted to join forces to file a class action suit. And of course I did. The summer seemed determined to do justice for me. Every day was a new layer of suffering for her, as if the sun had become my secret ally. And look, I'm not one to believe in instant karma, but at this point, if someone told me that the universe was on exclusive duty to avenge me, I'd believe it with my eyes closed. The woman started to really freak out. First, she tried to cover all the windows with aluminum foil. No, you didn't read that wrong. Aluminum foil? Her house looked like a sad, depressing version of a cheap spaceship. The windows shone so brightly that passers-by would slow down to try and figure out if they were selling a giant baked potato inside. They say that at night, the reflection of the moon hitting the walls made the house look like a disoriented lighthouse. Then came the phase of camping tents tied to the sides of the house. Each week was a new gimmick, a desperate attempt to block out the heat she herself had released. And the more she tried to fix it, the more ridiculous it got. Even the most patient people in the neighborhood began to comment. In WhatsApp groups, at HOA meetings, even in line at the supermarket, the woman became a meme, literally. There was a neighbor who put up a poster on his condominium door with a montage of her house on fire, with the caption, "Welcome to the HOA sauna." What about her? She pretended it wasn't her business. She left the house with that pose of always being right, wearing white linen clothes as if that were magic against 50 degrees of brain-rotting heat. And me, well, I watched it all in the best none-of-my-business style while I watered my new tree seedlings. Because yes, I had already started replanting, only this time with a fence, cameras, and signs threatening to sue anyone who looked the wrong way. But a disaster foretold is not all about heat. One fine day, in the middle of the afternoon, while I was trying to pretend that working on the computer wasn't the same as frying inside a microwave, I heard a bang. You know that kind of sound that makes your heart want to jump out of your chest? A dry bam, like glass bursting or something falling. I ran out into the yard thinking that some of her gadgets had flown my way. As it turned out, one of her tents, weakened by the hot wind and the ridiculous structure she had improvised, collapsed onto her car. A brand new SUV, metallic silver, which now looked like a crumpled sardine can. The woman appeared on the scene seconds later, dressed in a white robe that looked as if it had been drenched in sweat, screaming as if the sky had fallen in on her. And, technically, it did. The hot sky and stupidity all together. I confess I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. It was too much for one vengeful little heart. I stayed there for a few minutes, pretending I was examining my plants, just so I could hear her shouting, threatening to sue the tent manufacturer, the condominium, the hostile weather conditions. That was the best one. She shouted at anyone who passed by, as if the heat, gravity, and her own stupidity were problems that could be solved by shouting. The car, of course, became a monumental loss. I heard that her insurance didn't cover damage caused by unregulated improvised structures. Translation, she was going to pay out of pocket. And out of pocket. Because as far as I knew, she was mired in debt after trying to renovate the whole house at the last minute. To make matters worse, the woman decided to resort to drastic measures. She showed up on some neighbors' doorsteps offering free community gardening advice sessions, saying that we should all do our bit to keep the street nice and safe. Loosely translated, she wanted everyone to uproot trees so it wouldn't look bad on her alone. Pathetic attempt. All she did was ask for a petition to take down the sun, too. When she didn't get any support, she started spreading rumors that my new tree seedlings were illegal according to the internal regulations. He sent emails, called HOA board members, tried to use any loophole to force their removal. But this time, I was prepared. I had formal authorization, approved plans, everything within the law. And each time she tried to get to me, it was she who got into more trouble. I began to realize that she wasn't just being stubborn. She was falling apart, physically and emotionally. It was as if the heat had melted what little sense she had left. The woman was trapped, becoming a laughingstock, and beginning to understand, albeit slowly, that she wasn't going to be able to get out of this just by talking. Then, out of the blue, a court summons arrived. The woman was suing me for moral damage because, according to her, replanting the trees was an act of deliberate hostility that negatively affected coexistence in the neighborhood. I swear it took me about 5 minutes to stop laughing when I read that. She had cut down my trees without permission, destroyed the shade on the street, turned her own house into an oven, and even had the nerve to try to sue me for trying to rebuild what she had demolished. Right then and there, I decided that this story would end in court, preferably with a judge forcing her to wear a tinfoil hat during the hearing. When the summons arrived, my mind was already set on the whole thing. Do you know when you look at a situation so absurd that you don't even get angry anymore? You just accept that it's going to be fun. That was it. I picked up the envelope, read the legal mumbo-jumbo she'd sent, laughed, and thought, okay then, let's play. I hired a lawyer who looks like he was born in a suit and sarcasm. I explained the whole story to him, showed him photos, videos, documents, witnesses, even an informal dossier that some neighbors had spontaneously put together just to laugh at the situation. The guy listened quietly, without batting an eyebrow. In the end, he gave a half smile and said, "This woman dug the grave, jumped in, and is still asking us to throw sand." The hearing was scheduled. The whole neighborhood was abuzz. I've never seen so many people excited to go to court. It seemed as if we were all going to watch the final of the World Miko Championship. There was even a lottery going on about how long she would last before making a fuss in the middle of the session. On the day, she showed up in a beige social dress, her makeup melting under the heat that even the air conditioning in the courthouse couldn't alleviate. Her skin shone with sweat and stubbornness, and, as always, the look on her face of someone who believes to the end that she'll be able to turn the tide just by shouting. The hearing was a show in itself. First, the woman tried to convince the judge that cutting down trees without authorization was an act of aesthetic preservation under the HOA regulations. Only no clause in the regulations gave her that power. And my lawyer, who is practically an artist of formal humiliation, started rubbing it in her face with official documents, regulations, city hall records, even email captures where she herself bragged to other HOA board members that she had solved the visual problem of my yard. It was pathetic. She looked like she was going to evaporate from all the embarrassment and heat. Then she tried to argue that the new trees I planted were causing visual pollution and that the neighborhood had lost market value. But then came the testimonies from the neighbors, each one better than the last. There was Mrs. Marge from the end of the street, who said that since I replanted the trees, the environment has become more beautiful and breathable. There was Howard, who brought before and after photos showing how the shade has improved for everyone, except her, of course. And then there was the icing on the cake. The local realtor testified that the houses near the wooded areas had even gone up in price, while hers, well, it was hotter than asphalt and more devalued than the currency of a bankrupt country. At this point, she was sweating so much that she felt like she was going to dissolve in her chair. The judge was extremely professional, but you could sense his desire to laugh. In the end, he handed down his verdict with the same calm as someone who explains to a tantruming child why they can't have ice cream for breakfast. Her lawsuit was totally unfounded, and I was even allowed to sue her for material and moral damages. And, oh, how I sued. Every tree cut down without permission became a line in the claim for damages. Every centimeter of shade torn away became a number on the bill. The costs of replanting, the months of absurd heat, the increase in electricity bills, it all added up. And in the end, she was ordered to pay a sum that will probably cost her a good few years of her comfortable life. When the judge finished reading out the sentence, she jumped up, as red as a supermarket tomato, and started mumbling something about appealing, reversing, starting again. But it was too late. The appeals process requires the fine to be deposited in court, and she couldn't even pay what she owed, let alone play at appealing. The woman left the courtroom on wobbly legs, her hair stuck to her sweaty forehead, dragging her feet like she knew it was over. I left with my head held high, greeting half the neighborhood that was waiting at the door for the outcome as if it were the premiere of a superhero movie. The following week, to complete the humiliation, forced renovations began on her house. Obligations of the court itself, correcting infractions by the HOA, repairing the tents that had collapsed, installing safety barriers to prevent further accidents. Her house became a noisy, disorganized construction site, and she, the once queen of community standards, became the official joke of the block. Little by little, I rebuilt my yard. The new trees grew quickly, as if they knew they were there to honor their felled sisters. The shade returned, the freshness too. My balcony became my refuge again, this time even better, with the extra flavor of knowing that justice is sometimes done with sun, sweat, and a good dose of patience. And what about her? Well, she ended up moving out, unofficially, of course. First, she showed up less at meetings. Then she stopped sending ridiculous emails. And one fine day, her SUV disappeared from the garage, without warning. They say she went to live in an even more gated community, where she could boss around other people's trees in peace. I sincerely hope she learned something, or that she chose a house without any trees to cut down. That way, at least she doesn't need anyone but herself to live in her own private hell. Do you think she deserved to roast herself in her own house? Or was it too little too late? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to leave your likes below.